The Cold War did not end. It paused. That distinction matters more than most people realize, and by the time this narration is finished, the difference between a pause and an ending will feel like the most important thing you have never been asked to consider. There is a version of history taught in schools and repeated in documentary films where the Cold War sits in a kind of controlled frame. It begins with the division of Europe and the iron language of Winston Churchill, and it ends with a wall coming down in Berlin while crowds cheer in the November cold. Between those 2 points, the story usually includes missiles in Cuba, spies swapped on foggy bridges, and a long economic competition between two systems that could not agree on the value of a human life. That version is not wrong. It is simply incomplete in ways that are worth examining slowly and without flinching. The reality operating underneath that version was a parallel world of decisions made in basements, of systems built to function after the people who designed them were already dead, of experiments conducted on soldiers and civilians and entire cities without their knowledge or consent, of automated protocols that came within seconds of ending organized human civilization on multiple documented occasions. The Cold War was not mostly peaceful. It was mostly hidden. The peace was a surface. Beneath it, governments on both sides were doing things that would not survive public exposure, and they knew it. And they did them anyway, and they buried the records, and in some cases those records have only recently begun to surface, and in other cases they have not surfaced at all. What follows is an account of 18 experiments, programs and institutional decisions from the Cold War period that reveal the true character of that conflict. Not the ideological character, not the geopolitical character, but the procedural character. The way fear was managed not through wisdom or restraint, but through systems, protocols, and administrative distance. The way catastrophe was avoided not because of human judgment, but despite it. The way the machinery of deterrence was built to function without consent, without oversight, and in some configurations, without any human being involved in the final decision at all. The first of these involves the American military's systematic exposure of its own soldiers to nuclear weapons. This was not an accident. It was a program. It had a name, it had a budget, it had supervisors who wrote memos and attended meetings and went home at the end of the day to their families. Between 1945 and 1962, the United States military deliberately detonated nuclear weapons in the proximity of American ground troops for the explicit purpose of studying the psychological and physiological effects of nuclear combat exposure. The official rationale was that soldiers needed to be desensitized to nuclear environments so they would not freeze or flee during an actual nuclear exchange. This reasoning assumed, without much supporting evidence, that a nuclear exchange was something soldiers could be trained to survive. It also assumed that the men being used as subjects in this program had given meaningful consent, which they had not. They were told to crouch in trenches or march toward ground zero or watch from elevated bleachers while weapons with yields measured in kilotons detonated within miles of where they stood. Some were given rudimentary protective equipment. Many were not. They were told the radiation levels were safe. The people telling them this either did not know or did not care that this was false. The tests were conducted at the Nevada test site, in the Pacific at Bikini and Eniwetok atolls, and at various classified locations. The soldiers involved were drawn from active duty units across all branches of the military. They were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were ordered to participate, and in the military context of the 1950s, an order was an order. The men who later developed cancers, who watched their children born with abnormalities, who spent decades trying to get the Department of Defense to acknowledge what had been done to them, were told for years that their illnesses were not connected to the tests. The records were classified. The studies were sealed. The institutional response was silence, followed by denial, followed by, eventually, partial acknowledgement that came too late for most of the men affected. What makes this experiment significant beyond its cruelty is its procedural nature. No single person designed a program to give American soldiers cancer. Instead, a series of institutional decisions, each one defensible in isolation, each one approved by the appropriate committee, accumulated into a systematic exposure of human beings to lethal radiation in the name of military readiness. The machinery of bureaucracy produced outcomes that no individual in that bureaucracy would have endorsed if asked directly. This pattern, the way institutional logic generates atrocity through the accumulation of individually reasonable-seeming decisions, is the defining feature of the Cold War's hidden history. The second experiment did not involve soldiers. It involved an entire city. In 1950, the United States Navy conducted an operation called Operation Sea Spray, in which a vessel traveling off the coast of San Francisco released a biological agent called Serratia marcescens into the air over the bay. The intent was to test the vulnerability of American coastal cities to biological warfare attack by a hostile power. The Navy wanted to know how far a biological agent released offshore could penetrate into an urban area, how the wind and weather affected dispersal, how long the agent remained viable in an outdoor environment. These were legitimate strategic questions in the context of the period. The method of answering them was to expose the entire population of San Francisco to a live biological agent without informing them. Serratia marcescens was chosen in part because it produces a distinctive red pigmentation that makes it easy to track in environmental samples. Military planners had classified it as harmless, which was convenient given what they intended to do with it. In the weeks following the test, the city's hospitals reported an unusual cluster of urinary tract infections caused by Serratia marcescens, a bacterium previously rare in the city's medical records. One man, a retired pipe fitter named Edward Nevin, developed a Serratia infection that spread to his heart valves. He died. His family sued the federal government. The government denied any connection. The records were classified. The lawsuit was dismissed. Operation Sea Spray was not unique. It was one of hundreds of similar tests conducted on American cities over the following 2 decades. Minneapolis, St. Louis, and New York were among the cities subjected to open-air releases of various substances, some classified as simulants and some with more ambiguous toxicological profiles. The residents of these cities were not informed. They were not consulted. They had no mechanism for consent and no avenue for recourse. The tests were conducted under authority derived from national security exemptions that placed them beyond the reach of civilian oversight. The men who designed and executed these programs believed, apparently without much internal conflict, that the security imperative justified the exposure of American citizens to experimental substances without their knowledge. The institutional logic was self-sealing. The secrecy required to protect the program from oversight also protected the program from accountability for its outcomes. The third experiment was conducted not on soldiers or civilians, but on the concept of truth itself. Project MKUltra was the CIA's program of research into mind control, behavioral modification, and the pharmacological manipulation of human subjects. It operated from 1953 to at least 1973, though some evidence suggests that elements of it continued under different designations after the official termination. The program encompassed more than 150 separate research projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and private facilities across the United States and Canada. Its subjects included mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, sex workers, and in some cases ordinary citizens who were dosed without their knowledge in scenarios designed to mimic conditions the CIA anticipated encountering in real-world intelligence operations. The most extensively documented phase of MKUltra involved LSD, which CIA researchers believed might function as a truth serum or a means of inducing a state of psychological compliance in interrogation subjects. The hypothesis was never confirmed because LSD does not work that way, but the testing continued for years after the evidence failed to support it. Subjects were given doses of LSD without warning, in some cases repeatedly over extended periods, and their responses were observed and documented by researchers who were sometimes not identified as government employees. Some subjects suffered lasting psychological damage. At least one, A CIA employee named Frank Olson died under circumstances that were officially classified as a suicide, but that his family and subsequent investigators have argued show evidence of something more deliberate. What is most revealing about MKUltra is not the specific experiments, but the institutional architecture that supported them. The program was funded through a network of front organizations and passed through accounts that made it invisible to congressional oversight. The researchers involved were protected by classification designations that prevented them from discussing their work with outside reviewers. The CIA's director at the time, Alan Dulles, had personally authorized the program's expansion after receiving briefings on Soviet and Chinese research into similar areas. The program's existence was known to a relatively small number of people within the agency and within the executive branch. It was not known to the American public, and it was not known to the subjects on whom it was conducted. When the program was partially exposed in 1977 through Senate hearings initiated after a Freedom of Information request unearthed a set of documents that had survived a prior destruction order, the CIA's response was to characterize the program as a product of its time, as something that reflected the fears and pressures of the early Cold War period in ways that should be understood if not excused. This framing, which positioned institutional atrocity as a comprehensible response to historical circumstances, has since become the standard mode of official acknowledgement for Cold War-era programs. It is worth noting that this framing contains an implicit argument for the indefinite continuation of similar programs, since historical circumstances of comparable intensity have never entirely gone away. The fourth experiment was atmospheric. It was called Operation Starfish Prime, and it took place on the night of July 9, 1962, when the United States detonated a thermonuclear weapon with a yield of approximately 1.4 megatons at an altitude of 400 kilometers above Johnston Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. The explosion was visible across a vast swath of the Pacific. In Hawaii, nearly 1,400 kilometers away, the detonation produced an aurora-like display that lit the night sky for several minutes and caused streetlights to fail across the island. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the detonation disabled or damaged several satellites in low Earth orbit, including some that had not been predicted to be affected. It also produced a persistent radiation belt in the Van Allen belts that remained measurable for years afterward. The stated purpose of Starfish Prime was to study the effects of high-altitude nuclear detonation on radar, communications, and satellite systems. This was a genuine research objective in the context of a period when both superpowers were developing anti-satellite capabilities and exploring the electromagnetic effects of nuclear weapons at extreme altitudes. What the test also demonstrated, as a secondary finding, was that a sufficiently powerful nuclear detonation in the upper atmosphere could disable electronic infrastructure across continental distances without directly targeting population centers. This finding would later become the basis for what military planners called the electromagnetic pulse threat, a scenario in which a single nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude could collapse the electrical grid and communications infrastructure of an entire nation without the blast or thermal effects reaching the ground. The Soviet Union conducted its own series of high-altitude nuclear tests in the same period, some of which produced effects on their own infrastructure that Soviet military planners had not fully anticipated. The most dramatic of these, conducted over Kazakhstan in October 1962 in a series called Operation K, or the Soviet ABM program, produced electromagnetic effects that disabled a power transmission line over 1,000 kilometers long and started a fire at a power plant. The fact that these tests were being conducted during the same week as the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the probability of a deliberate nuclear exchange between the superpowers was at its highest measured point, is a detail that does not receive adequate attention in most historical accounts. The fifth experiment was biological and was conducted not on human subjects, but on the natural world in ways that had consequences for human populations. Between 1961 and 1971, The United States military conducted Operation Ranch Hand, an aerial herbicide program over South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that deployed approximately 76 million liters of herbicide mixtures over an area of roughly 3.6 million acres. The most widely used of these mixtures was Agent Orange, a 50-50 combination of two phenoxy herbicides that was later found to be contaminated with 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, a dioxin compound now classified as a known human carcinogen. The program's stated purpose was to deny enemy forces the cover of jungle vegetation and to destroy food crops that might sustain North Vietnamese and Viet Cong supply operations. These were tactical objectives embedded within a broader strategic logic that treated the Vietnamese landscape as an obstacle to American military effectiveness. The men who designed and implemented the program had access to some toxicological data on the herbicide components, though the full extent of dioxin contamination was not understood until later. The aircraft crews who loaded and dispensed the herbicides received no special protective equipment and were not informed of potential health risks. The Vietnamese civilians whose land was being treated were not consulted and had no recourse. The long-term health effects of Agent Orange exposure on both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans were disputed for decades by the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the chemical manufacturers who had produced the herbicides under government contract. The institutional pattern was familiar: classification, denial, delayed acknowledgement, and eventual partial compensation that arrived too late for most of those affected. What makes Ranch Hand distinctive within the catalog of Cold War experiments is its scale. This was not a test conducted on a small population in a controlled setting. It was an open-air biological modification of an entire ecosystem involving tens of millions of human beings over a decade, and it was conducted with the same bureaucratic calm that characterized all of the programs in this account. The sixth experiment was conducted in space, or rather in the anticipation of space, and it belongs to a category of Cold War research that can only be described as planning for conditions that human civilization had never previously encountered. Project A119 was a classified Air Force study initiated in 1958 and led by a physicist named Leonard Rifle that examined the feasibility and potential psychological impact of detonating a nuclear weapon on the visible surface of the moon. The study was never executed, but its existence reveals something important about the cognitive environment of Cold War military planning. The rationale, such as it was that a nuclear detonation on the lunar surface would produce a flash visible to observers on Earth with the naked eye, and that this demonstration of American technical capability would serve as a powerful propaganda counter to the Soviet Union's early dominance of the space race. Sputnik had launched in 1957. The American public and American military planners were in a state of acute anxiety about Soviet technological superiority. The moonshot, in this context, was conceived not as an act of exploration, but as a territorial display, a way of writing American power on a surface visible to the entire planet. Rifle's study concluded that the project was technically feasible, but scientifically undesirable, since the detonation would destroy information that could be gathered from intact lunar soil samples. The study also noted that public reaction to a nuclear detonation on the moon might not be uniformly positive, an observation that reflected a certain understatement characteristic of classified military research. The project was never approved. The study was classified and remained unknown to the public until Rifle disclosed its existence in 2000. One of the junior researchers involved in the study was a young graduate student named Carl Sagan, who had used some of the classified data from the project in a fellowship application, a detail that surfaced decades later and caused a brief public discussion about the ethics of scientific work conducted under national security classification. The seventh experiment was not a single program, but a system, and it was a system designed to do something that no technology had previously been asked to do. It was called the Dead Hand, or in Russian, perimeter. and it was the Soviet Union's automated nuclear retaliatory system developed in the early 1980s and believed to remain operational in some form to this day. The system was designed to address a specific strategic problem: the possibility that a sufficiently rapid and precisely targeted American first strike could destroy Soviet command and control infrastructure before Soviet leaders could authorize a retaliatory strike. If Soviet missiles could not be launched because all of the people authorized to launch them were already dead, the deterrent value of those missiles was compromised. The solution the Soviet military designed was a system that could authorize and execute a nuclear strike without requiring human decision at the final stage. Perimeter used a network of sensors to monitor for indicators of a nuclear attack, including seismic sensors, radiation detectors, and pressure wave monitors. If the system determined, on the basis of those sensor readings, that a nuclear attack was underway and that it had been unable to reach the humans in the command chain, it would transfer launch authority to a specially hardened command rocket, which would then fly over Soviet missile fields, broadcasting launch codes that would authorize the missiles to fire autonomously. The system was designed to be survivable, meaning that even if every Soviet military official and political leader had been killed, the missiles would still launch. This was, from the perspective of deterrence theory, a rational design, a retaliatory capability that could be eliminated by a first strike provided much weaker deterrence than one that could survive a first strike. The problem was that a system designed to launch nuclear weapons without human authorization was, by definition, a system that could launch nuclear weapons in response to a false alarm, to a sensor malfunction, to a software error, or to a set of circumstances that a human observer would immediately recognize as not constituting a nuclear attack. American military planners were aware of the existence of Perimeter by the mid-1980s. The system was one of the reasons that the Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative, the missile defense program that critics called Star Wars, was viewed by Soviet military planners as an offensive rather than a defensive development. A missile defense system that could intercept a retaliatory strike following an American first strike would, in Soviet military logic, represent a capability that made a first strike viable. This perception accelerated the refinement of Perimeter and contributed to a general increase in the automation of Soviet nuclear command systems during the period. The direction of the logic was toward less human involvement, not more. The eighth experiment was not Soviet, but American, and it was also a system rather than a single event. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, known as the PSYOP, was the United States master plan for nuclear war. It was first developed in 1960 and was revised continuously throughout the Cold War period. What the PSYOP represented in its various iterations was the translation of nuclear deterrence into operational planning, the conversion of the abstract logic of mutually assured destruction into specific targeting lists, weapons assignments, delivery sequences, and damage expectation calculations. The PSYOP was, by design, a comprehensive and inflexible document. It was comprehensive because its designers believed that any nuclear exchange would rapidly escalate to general war, and that the United States needed to be prepared to execute a full-scale nuclear strike on short notice. It was inflexible because the time constraints of nuclear warfare, the minutes between a missile launch and a missile impact, made elaborate real-time decision-making impractical. Once the plan was activated, it would execute largely as designed, with limited capacity for human intervention at intermediate stages. What the PSYOP's designers did not fully anticipate, or did not allow themselves to fully consider, was that the plan's comprehensiveness and inflexibility created its own dangers. In the early 1960s, the PSYOP's first strike options called for the delivery of thousands of nuclear warheads against the Soviet Union, China, and Soviet-aligned states in Eastern Europe in a sequence lasting several hours. The projected casualty figures, which were classified but have since been partially released, were in the range of several 100 million deaths in the first exchange. There was no option in the original PSYOP for a limited nuclear strike, a demonstration detonation, or a proportionate response to a limited Soviet attack. There was essentially one option: full-scale nuclear war, executed according to a detailed, predetermined sequence. When Defense Secretary Robert McNamara first reviewed the PSYOP in 1961, he reportedly left the briefing visibly shaken. He described the plan as a massive, total, comprehensive, and relatively automatic strike against the entire communist world. He subsequently ordered revisions that introduced more limited options, but the fundamental architecture of the PSYOP, a comprehensive targeting plan designed for execution rather than deliberation, persisted in various forms throughout the Cold War. The plan was the institutionalization of a logic that had no room for restraint once it was activated. The ninth experiment involved the human nervous system and the management of the men who were authorized to end civilization. The United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command maintained a force of nuclear-armed bombers on continuous airborne alert beginning in 1960. The program was called Operation Chrome Dome, and at its peak, it kept as many as 12 B-52 bombers in the air at all times, each carrying thermonuclear weapons, each flying predetermined routes that kept them in position to reach Soviet targets within hours of receiving a launch order. The purpose was to ensure that even if Soviet missiles destroyed American airfields before bombers could take off, a retaliatory capability would survive in the aircraft already airborne. The men who flew these missions were doing something that had no historical precedent. They were sitting in aircraft carrying weapons capable of destroying cities for shifts of 24 hours or more, knowing that if they received a specific coded order, they would fly toward the Soviet Union and release their weapons, and that this act would be one component of a response that would kill tens of millions of people. The psychological demands of this role were not well understood when the program began, and the Air Force's management of those demands was largely administrative. Crews were screened for psychological stability. They were briefed on their mission parameters. They were told that their role was a deterrent, that the point was to make the attack unnecessary, that the strength of their presence in the air was the thing that kept the peace. This was all true, as far as it went. What the administrative framing could not address was what happened in the small hours of the morning at high altitude over the North Atlantic, when the abstraction of nuclear deterrence resolved into the concrete reality of two men in a cockpit with weapons of mass destruction, flying a route that had been calculated to bring them to within range of a series of targets that they had been briefed on in detail. The Air Force studied the psychological profiles of Chrome Dome crews extensively. The studies found, not surprisingly, that extended airborne nuclear alert produced distinctive psychological effects. They also found that the most effective coping mechanism available to the crews was the same one used in all high-stress military environments: the normalization of the exceptional through routine, procedure, and institutional identity. The men who flew these missions managed the psychological weight of their role by treating it as a job with unusual stakes, but a job governed by checklists and procedures and clear chains of command. The administrative made the apocalyptic manageable. This management strategy had a cost, which became visible on January 17, 1966, when a B-52 on a Chrome Dome mission collided with a KC-135 tanker aircraft during a refueling operation over the Spanish coast near the town of Palomares. Both aircraft were destroyed. 4 hydrogen bombs fell from the disintegrating B-52. 3 of them landed on Spanish soil. 1 fell into the Mediterranean. The conventional explosive components of 2 of the land-based bombs detonated on impact, scattering plutonium across several square kilometers of Spanish farmland. The 4th bomb's parachute system deployed successfully, and it came down in a relatively intact condition that allowed recovery without further detonation. The bomb that fell into the sea was not recovered for 80 days. The Palomares incident did not result in a nuclear detonation. The bomb's safety systems functioned as designed, and the conditions for a nuclear yield, the precise simultaneous detonation of the weapon's multiple conventional explosive lenses, were not met. But the incident demonstrated with high visibility the degree to which the management of nuclear weapons at the operational level was subject to the ordinary risks of aviation: fatigue, weather, mechanical failure, Human error during a routine procedure. The Chrome Dome program was modified after Palomares and was eventually terminated entirely after a 1968 crash in Greenland that contaminated a wide area of sea ice with plutonium and other radioactive materials. But the termination of Chrome Dome did not eliminate the underlying logic. It displaced it into other systems, other protocols, other operational modes that were less visible and therefore less subject to the kind of public scrutiny that follows a crash over inhabited territory. The 10th experiment took place inside the human body and was conducted by an agency that was not supposed to be conducting domestic operations. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through at least the 1970s, the Atomic Energy Commission, the predecessor to the Department of Energy, conducted a series of experiments involving the injection of radioactive materials into human subjects for the purpose of studying absorption, distribution, and elimination rates in living tissue. The subjects included hospital patients, prisoners, and in some documented cases, individuals who were not informed that the substances they were receiving were radioactive. The most extensively documented series of these experiments involved the injection of plutonium into patients at several American hospitals, including the University of California, San Francisco, the University of Rochester, and the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies. The patients selected for these procedures were generally individuals with serious medical conditions who had been deemed to have a limited life expectancy, a selection criterion that was intended to minimize the ethical complications of exposing subjects to a known toxin, but that also meant the subjects were in a vulnerable state and in some cases may not have had full cognitive capacity to evaluate what they were being asked to consent to. The Atomic Energy Commission's interest in these studies was practical. The Commission needed data on how plutonium behaved in the human body to set exposure limits for workers in the nuclear weapons production complex. Existing animal data was inadequate for this purpose, in part because of differences between animal and human metabolic rates, and in part because the weapons program produced exposure scenarios that had no animal model equivalent. The decision to obtain this data from human subjects was made in the institutional context of a program that was already operating under conditions of extreme secrecy and that had normalized the use of human beings as components of its research infrastructure. The experiments were classified. The results were published in internal reports that circulated within the Atomic Energy Commission and its associated research institutions, but were not publicly available. The subjects were not informed of the nature of the substances they received, and in most cases they were not informed of the results. Several of the subjects lived long enough to be affected by the delayed consequences of plutonium exposure, though establishing direct causation in individual cases was complicated by their pre-existing medical conditions. The Commission's position, maintained for decades, was that the experiments had been conducted according to the standards of the period, which was technically accurate in the sense that the period standards did not require informed consent for research conducted under national security classification. The 11th experiment was strategic and geographical, and it was conducted not on the human body, but on the idea of survivable government. Beginning in the 1950s and continuing through the Cold War period, the United States government constructed a network of underground facilities designed to preserve continuity of government operations in the event of a nuclear attack. These facilities ranged from the relatively well-known, such as the NORAD installation inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, to the less publicized, such as the installation under the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, that was intended to house the United States Congress during a nuclear emergency. The Greenbrier facility, which operated under the code name Project Greek Island, was built between 1958 and 1961 in a wing of the resort that was constructed simultaneously with and covertly attached to a legitimate expansion of the hotel's facilities. The installation included a legislative chamber large enough to accommodate all members of Congress, dormitory space, a communications center, a decontamination facility, and enough food and water to sustain its intended population for 60 days. It was maintained in a state of operational readiness for decades, staffed by employees who worked at the resort as cover and were authorized to secure the facility and activate it within hours of receiving an emergency notification. The facility was never activated. Its existence was revealed in 1992 by a Washington Post reporter named Ted Gupp, at which point the government acknowledged the installation and decommissioned it, reasoning that a facility whose existence was publicly known could not serve its intended purpose. The revelation prompted a brief public discussion about the nature of continuity of government planning and the implicit assumptions it embodied. A facility designed to preserve Congress during a nuclear war presupposed that there would be a Congress to preserve, that the constitutional structure of the government would retain meaning after a nuclear exchange, and that the 60-day supply of provisions represented a reasonable estimate of the time required for the post-nuclear environment to become livable. These were assumptions that no one who understood the actual effects of nuclear weapons could hold with much confidence, but they were assumptions that an institution must maintain if it is going to plan for its own survival at all. The 12th experiment was psychological in the broadest sense, and it was conducted on the populations of both superpowers simultaneously, though by different methods. The civil defense programs of the Cold War period were the most elaborate exercises in institutional management of civilian fear that any government had previously attempted. In the United States, the Federal Civil Defense Administration produced films, pamphlets, training programs, and public exercises designed to convince the American population that nuclear war was survivable and that survival required preparation and compliance with government instructions. The most famous product of this effort was the Duck and Cover program, which used a cartoon turtle to teach schoolchildren to protect themselves from nuclear attack by crouching under their desks. Duck and Cover has since become an object of retrospective ridicule because the protection offered by a school desk against a thermonuclear weapon is effectively zero. But the program was not primarily about physical protection, it was about psychological management. The civil defense apparatus served several institutional purposes simultaneously. It gave the public a sense of agency in a situation where they had none. It provided a behavioral script that could absorb the anxiety generated by the possibility of annihilation and redirect it toward productive action. It signaled to the Soviet Union that the American public had the psychological resilience to withstand nuclear threats, which was itself a component of deterrence. And it maintained the political viability of the nuclear arsenal by keeping the public's relationship with nuclear weapons in the register of manageable risk rather than existential horror. What the civil defense program could not acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have destroyed the program's function, was that the scientists and military planners who designed it knew that nuclear war was not survivable in any meaningful sense for the populations of targeted cities. The casualty projections in classified documents from the period were not compatible with the survivability narrative of the public program. The two existed simultaneously in different institutional spaces, and the partition between them was maintained by the same classification system that protected all of the other programs in this account. The 13th experiment was technological and occurred at the intersection of nuclear weapons and the aviation industry. In the 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union pursued programs to develop nuclear-powered aircraft, which would have had essentially unlimited range and the ability to stay aloft indefinitely. The American program was called the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program. It ran from 1946 to 1961, cost approximately $1 billion, and produced no operational aircraft. The Soviet program, designated M60 and various other designations, ran in parallel and similarly produced no operational aircraft. Both programs encountered the same fundamental problem. Putting a nuclear reactor in an aircraft that also contained human beings required either very heavy shielding, which made the aircraft too heavy to fly, or very light shielding, which made the aircraft lethally radioactive to its crew. Various solutions to this problem were explored. One American concept involved a crew compartment surrounded by a lead and water shield of sufficient thickness to reduce radiation to acceptable levels at the cost of adding many tons to the aircraft's weight. Another concept involved flying the aircraft entirely remotely, eliminating the crew exposure problem at the cost of the navigational and decision-making capabilities that a human crew provided. A third concept involved accepting elevated radiation doses for the crew, reasoning that the missions enabled by nuclear propulsion would be of sufficient strategic value to justify the health costs to the airmen involved. This third option was evaluated with a seriousness that becomes deeply uncomfortable in retrospect, given that it was, in essence, a proposal to slowly irradiate military pilots in the service of strategic advantage. Neither program reached a point where these trade-offs had to be operationally resolved, but the fact that both programs explored the third option without immediately dismissing it on ethical grounds reveals something about the institutional logic of Cold War weapons development. The question was not whether to expose human beings to elevated radiation levels, because that question had already been answered affirmatively by the nuclear testing programs. The question was what level of exposure was strategically justified, and how to calculate the exchange rate between aircrew health and strategic capability. The 14th experiment was geopolitical and involved the planet's atmosphere. Project Storm Fury was a United States federal program operated jointly by the Navy and the Weather Bureau that attempted to weaken Atlantic hurricanes by seeding them with silver iodide crystals. The program ran from 1962 to 1983 and produced ambiguous results. What it also produced was an extended international diplomatic complication, because nations in the Caribbean and Central America periodically accused the United States of steering hurricanes toward their territories or weakening storms before they reached American coastlines at the expense of their own. These accusations were not supported by evidence, and the scientific consensus was that Project Storm Fury's actual effect on hurricane behavior was minimal and inconsistent. But the program existed within a Cold War context in which the idea of weaponized weather was taken seriously by military planners on both sides. The United States did conduct a separate, classified weather modification program during the Vietnam War, called Operation Popeye, which used cloud seeding to extend the monsoon season over North Vietnamese supply routes, increasing mud and flooding along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The program was classified at the highest levels and was not publicly acknowledged until 1971, when it was revealed through documents obtained by investigative journalists. Operation Popeye demonstrated that weather modification was not purely speculative. It was an operational capability that had been used in warfare. The revelation of the program led to international negotiations that produced the Environmental Modification Convention of 1977, which prohibited the military use of environmental modification techniques with widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. The convention was signed by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Its verification mechanisms were essentially non-existent. Both nations continued research into weather modification for military applications after signing it. The 15th experiment happened in space and in the ocean simultaneously, in the sense that it was a test of the systems designed to fight a war in both environments. Able Archer 83 was a NATO military exercise conducted in November 1983 that simulated a conventional conflict in Europe escalating to nuclear war. The exercise was realistic to an unusual degree. It used new communication procedures and radio formats that had not been used in previous exercises. It involved the participation of senior government officials, including heads of state, in some national components. It simulated the release of nuclear weapons through a sequence of commands that closely resembled actual nuclear release procedures. Soviet intelligence, which was monitoring the exercise closely, became genuinely uncertain about whether what it was observing was an exercise or preparation for an actual attack. The KGB had launched a major intelligence collection program in 1981 called Operation Ryan, which was explicitly tasked with detecting the early indicators of an American nuclear first strike. The operations analysts were primed to interpret ambiguous signals as evidence of an impending attack, which was precisely the cognitive set most likely to produce a false alarm. During Able Archer 83, Soviet nuclear forces were placed at an elevated state of alert. Soviet aircraft in East Germany and Poland were loaded with nuclear weapons and held on short-notice readiness. Some Soviet missile forces increased their alert status. The NATO commanders running Able Archer were not aware at the time of the degree to which their exercise had been misread by Soviet intelligence. They learned of it afterward, from a British agent named Oleg Gordievsky, who was providing intelligence to MI6 from within the KGB's London station. The near-miss quality of Able Archer 83 was not appreciated in real time by either side. It was reconstructed afterward from intelligence reports and defector debriefings, which meant that its significance depended on the accuracy of those sources and the analytical frameworks of the people interpreting them. The President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board issued a classified report in 1990 concluding that the Soviet reaction to Able Archer had been genuine and that the incident had represented a real, if inadvertent, approach to the kind of miscalculation that could trigger nuclear war. What Able Archer demonstrated was that the danger of nuclear war during the Cold War was not primarily a function of hostile intent. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wanted nuclear war. The danger was a function of the interaction between alert systems, intelligence collection operations, and the cognitive frameworks of analysts who had been institutionally trained to see the worst-case interpretation of ambiguous data as the responsible one. The system was calibrated for sensitivity, and sensitivity created its own dangers. The 16th experiment was conducted on a single individual and lasted approximately 6 minutes, and it came closer to nuclear war than almost any other event in the Cold War record. On September 26, 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite system called OKO reported that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles at the Soviet Union. The officer on duty at the command center that received this alert was a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. His responsibility, under Soviet military protocol, was to relay the alert through the chain of command, which would have initiated the process of preparing a retaliatory strike. Petrov did not relay the alert. He assessed the report as a probable malfunction and recorded his determination in the duty log as a false alarm. His reasoning was partly technical and partly intuitive. A genuine American first strike, he believed, would not begin with 5 missiles. 5 missiles would not destroy enough of the Soviet retaliatory capability to make a first strike strategically rational. A real first strike would involve hundreds of missiles arriving simultaneously, not a sequence of 5. The satellite system was also new and had not been fully operationally validated. The ground radar systems, which Petrov considered more reliable, had not confirmed the launch detection. Petrov was right. The OKO satellite had misidentified sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds as missile exhaust plumes. The United States had not launched any missiles. The Soviet early warning system had produced a false alarm of the most dangerous kind, a report of a nuclear attack during a period of extreme superpower tension in the weeks following the Soviet shootdown of Korean Airlines Flight 007 and during the period of maximum tension generated by the Able Archer exercise. The systems designed to provide warning had produced the threat they were designed to detect. Petrov's decision to treat the alert as a malfunction rather than a genuine attack prevented the false alarm from propagating into the command chain. Petrov was reprimanded for improperly filling out his duty log during the incident. He was subsequently reassigned to a less sensitive position and retired from military service. The Soviet government did not acknowledge the incident for decades. When Petrov's story became public in the mid-1990s through a disclosure by a retired Soviet general, it attracted significant attention, and Petrov received various international recognitions. What it did not produce was any fundamental change in the design of the systems that had created the situation in the first place. The OKO system's design flaw was corrected, but the underlying architecture, an early warning network connected to command systems calibrated to respond within minutes, remained in place because the alternative, slowing down the response time, was perceived as creating a different and equally serious vulnerability. The 17th experiment was medical and was conducted in the laboratories and hospitals of both superpowers. The development of biological weapons during the Cold War is one of the most extensively and deliberately obscured chapters of the conflict's history. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had signed the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, which prohibited the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. Both nations violated it. The American program was terminated by executive order in 1969, before the convention was signed, and was reportedly never resumed, though some critics have questioned whether all of its components were fully disclosed. The Soviet program not only continued after signing the convention, but expanded dramatically under a program called Biopreparat that at its peak employed approximately 60,000 scientists, engineers, and support personnel at over 40 facilities across the Soviet Union. Biopreparat was a state secret of the highest classification. Its existence was not publicly confirmed until 1992, when the Soviet Union had already ceased to exist, and details of the program emerged primarily through the testimony of defectors, the most significant of whom was a senior Biopreparat official named Ken Alibek, whose original name was Kanatjan Alibekov. Alibek described a program that had weaponized anthrax, plague, smallpox, and a range of other pathogens, some of them genetically modified to enhance lethality or resistance to antibiotics. He described weapons development that had continued at an accelerating pace throughout the 1980s, even as Soviet diplomats were attending meetings of the Biological Weapons Convention and asserting their nation's compliance with its provisions. The Sverdlovsk anthrax leak of 1979 was one of the incidents that subsequently confirmed Alibek's general account. In April of that year, an accidental release of anthrax spores from a Soviet military facility in Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, caused an outbreak that killed at least 66 people and possibly many more, according to post-Soviet investigations. The Soviet government's public explanation was that the outbreak had been caused by contaminated black market meat. This explanation was maintained for over a decade and was accepted, or at least not formally challenged, by some Western analysts who found it more comfortable than the alternative implication that the Soviet Union was operating a large-scale biological weapons program in explicit violation of an arms control treaty it had signed. The 18th experiment is the most abstract and the most consequential of those described in this account, and it was not a single program or a specific incident, but a doctrine. It was the doctrine of launch on warning, which was the policy, adopted by both superpowers at different points during the Cold War, of releasing nuclear weapons upon detecting an incoming attack, rather than waiting to absorb the attack before responding. The logic of launch on warning was straightforward from a deterrence standpoint. If the opposing side believed it could destroy your retaliatory capability in a first strike, it might be tempted to execute that first strike. If you could credibly commit to launching before the incoming missiles landed, the first strike lost its strategic value because your missiles would already be in the air. The problem with launch on warning was that it required the entire decision process, from the initial detection of an attack through the authorization and execution of a retaliatory launch, to be compressed into a time window of roughly 15 to 30 minutes, which was the flight time of an intercontinental ballistic missile from launch site to target. Within that window, a president or general secretary had to receive a briefing on the nature of the detected threat, evaluate its reliability, assess the available options, make a decision, and transmit the launch order through a chain of command to missile crews who had been waiting at their stations for exactly this message. This sequence required not only physical efficiency, but a specific kind of cognitive performance under conditions of extreme stress and incomplete information. The margin for error in this process was essentially zero: a false alarm in the detection system, an ambiguous radar reading, a communications failure that prevented clarifying information from reaching the decision-maker, a president who did not fully trust the people briefing him, a general who received unclear orders. Any of these factors could produce an outcome that diverged from the intended one in ways that could not be corrected after the fact. The decision to launch on warning was, in effect, a decision to outsource the final determination of global security to a collection of sensors, networks, and human beings operating under conditions that systematically degraded their capacity for careful judgment. Both superpowers knew this. The technical briefings, the war games, the studies conducted by the defense research establishments on both sides, all of them identified the fragility of the launch on warning posture. None of this knowledge produced a change in the fundamental policy. The policy persisted because the alternative, waiting to absorb a first strike before responding, was assessed as creating an unacceptable vulnerability, a judgment that was almost certainly correct in the narrow strategic context in which it was made. The logic of deterrence had, by this point, generated a situation in which every option was dangerous, and the least dangerous available option was still enormously so. What the Cold War produced, across the span of the 18 programs and incidents and systems described in this account, was not security. It produced the administrative management of insecurity. It produced institutions calibrated for paranoia, systems designed to function after human beings were dead, and a collective tolerance for catastrophic risk that was sustained not by confidence, but by the absence of any clearly better alternative. The men who designed these programs were not irrational. They were operating within a logic that was internally consistent, given its premises, and the premises were not ones they had chosen. They had inherited a world in which two powers possessing civilization-ending weapons faced each other across a division that neither could resolve, and they had responded to that world by building systems sophisticated enough to destroy it more efficiently. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 25, 1991. The Berlin Wall had come down 2 years earlier. The arms control treaties of the late 1980s and early 1990s reduced the number of deployed nuclear warheads on both sides substantially. The intelligence services of the successor states maintained various forms of cooperative contact with their American counterparts. By most of the measures available to journalists and historians and policy analysts, the Cold War was over. The nuclear weapons remained. The launch on warning doctrine remained. The perimeter system remained operational, or was believed to remain operational. The biological weapons knowledge dispersed through the dissolution of biopreparat into inadequately secured facilities across the former Soviet states. The institutional reflexes, the classification habits, the administrative management of existential risk, the tolerance for programs that treated human beings as components of security architecture rather than as the population security was supposed to protect. These did not dissolve with the Soviet Union. They were absorbed into new frameworks, renamed, reclassified, and continued under different organizational names in different geopolitical contexts. The systems built to manage the Cold War outlasted the Cold War. They are still running.